Okay, so welcome to parents. I will let people will be coming in, I guess. More, I'll randomly have to admit them. Exactly on key. It's always fun to learn with parents. Good to see you. I hope everyone enjoyed Pesach. So, if you don't like the topic, you have to blame Murray Ginsburg. I gave Murray Ginsburg a bunch of topics, and he chose this, so it's his fault, okay? So the question I want to deal with is a bit halachic, a bit theological, in advance of Yom HaAztmaut, which will be celebrated on Thursday this year, even though Hey Iyar is not Thursday, which you probably will figure out when Rosh Chodesh is, on Tuesday. But fundamentally, Yom HaAtzmaut is normally Hey Iyar. Why is it a Hey Iyar? Just so we get our Israeli history down here. Thank you. That was the declaration. I'm glad the guys in Roy Eliach's Zionism class understand what Hey Iyar is. Thank you. Yes. Go Rambam. Yes. I was in Rambam. I was never in that class. It wasn't mandatory when I was there. It was during double base. So El Chatay Ani Maskir. But
It's still doing double base.
what?
It's still doing double base.
I know. Yes, right. This kid. Though whatever. Look. I take it. Even though I'm in Oleh, I get to do the old Israeli thing of my grandfather fought in Milchemet Atzmaut, so I get to, I have the original Zionist credentials down. My grandfather came over from the Holocaust and fought in 1948. But yes, Hey Iyar was the day that the state of Israel was declared a state. And immediately, right after that happened, one of the first halachic controversies that was discussed in the context of the state was the question of how we celebrate that moment halachically. Obviously, a similar conversation began in 1967, which was Six-Day War. Thank you, Yaakov. I'm just checking, right? I hope people know this basic history. So what I want to do is as follows. I want to present the basic halachic argumentation offered by the poskim both in 48 and in 67 in favor of establishing some sort of holiday to commemorate that moment that. Well, we'll talk about why you would, why you wouldn't, what the halachic issues involved are, the theological issues are involved, and what response there was. I'm going to put it out there. The response that I'm going to deal with mostly are from people who share the belief that the state of Israel, the creation of the state of Israel, was a positive religious event. Right? The fact that Rav Yoel Teitelbaum did not think you say Hallel and Yom HaAztmaut shouldn't surprise everyone. I hope you know that is. But if you don't, he's better known as the Satmar Rav, right? The Satmar Rebbe. It's not a surprise to anyone that he didn't say that, but that's because he thought it was negative. It was a Maaseh Satan. We will briefly address that. But we'll see the halachic arguments against creating some sort of formal halachic commemoration, holiday, Hallel, etc., even from within the camp of people who, broadly speaking, are considered religious Zionists, or close to it in the case of Rav Ovadia, but people who fundamentally did see religious value in the state, but still didn't necessarily believe that Hallel or a holiday was the proper way of commemorating it. Okay? Okay. So
double check if you don't have any of these. I have to write a check eventually for my almost both.
I'm just going to turn down sound a little bit. Okay.
For insurance.
I can't turn down the sound totally on my phone, right? No. Okay. I can mute everyone, right? That's what I can do. Mute all. There we go. Fine. You can unmute yourself for questions, but okay. Yaakov, at some point my knapsack is right behind you, and I have a book from the Rav there that I'm going to need, but I don't need it this second, but at some point. If I have time, I'll draw on it. Okay, fine. So, for those of you who got through the sources, and yes, you complained to me that it was long, but I don't know what to do. If I make it short because I don't put the English, then you complain that there's no English. I put the English, it makes it long. You complain that it's too long. I don't know.
English.
I knew Avi was going to say that. Yes, only put the English. No, then I'm the one complaining, Avi. It's a different problem. Okay, so let's try to trace the argument. Okay, let's start with the argument in favor of saying Hallel / creating some sort of holiday celebration of the creation of the state. Okay, let's try let's reconstruct that argument. And this is an argument made by Rav Shalom Rath, who I gave you, but it was made by many of the early religious Zionist poskim. Okay, so someone want to try to reconstruct their thought process based on the sources I gave you, Avi. What?
There's English for these ones too. But
all arguments can be constructed from the English. Okay, fine. Let's start as follows. Okay? First step. Whatever Yom HaAtzmaut is and celebrates, the creation of the state of Israel is a post-biblical event. Okay? Yes? So far, you're with me. Post-biblical event. That means that if you want to look for the earliest model, what is the most likely model or models that the poskim are going to draw on? Hanukkah and Purim, right? Hanukkah and Purim are the two major post-biblical, even though, sure, Purim is like in the end of Ketuvim, but it's already the rabbinic period, right, in that sense, right, meaning it's not biblical. Those are the two events that we continue to celebrate, right, that we continue to celebrate. Now, there were others. There were other events, and they were recorded where, Yehonatan?
In Megillat Ta'anit.
Megillat Ta'anit, very good. You knew that before, Shir, I know. But Megillat Ta'anit is a book contemporaneous to Chazal. It is the record of all celebrated days in the time of the Beit HaMikdash that were holidays, mini holidays that were celebrated throughout the year. Many of them are recorded at different places in the Gemara. Right, the one I mentioned to Yehonatan is one of the surprising ones. This one day that we now celebrate as a fast originally was a holiday, and that is Tanit Esther was in the time of Megillat Tanit, a holiday, not a fast, known as Yom Nikanor. Okay, no, known as Yom Nikanor. Okay, so Hanukkah and Purim we celebrate with a holiday, and in one case with Hallel, in the other case with a replacement of Hallel, right? Meaning Megillah, as Rava says, Kriyata Zewi Hilula, right? So both of these miracles are celebrating post-biblical events with a holiday in either a Hallel or a Hallel replacement. Okay, so that's the most logical start to it. Now, the Gemara already noticed, however, that there is a problem with celebrating Purim and Hanukkah themselves. And what is their problem? Right? What's the problem that Chazal had with celebrating Purim? Right? Chazal had a problem they wanted to solve. What was the problem they wanted to solve? It's not Minat Torah, and therefore
adding something to the Torah.
very good. Right? There's a Isser in the Torah called Bal Tosif. Right? You cannot add to the Torah. And therefore, the Gemara in number 1 here says, Tanu Rabbanan, 48 Nevi'im v'sheva Nevi'ot nitnabu lahem liYisrael. Right? There were 48 male prophets and 7 female prophets who prophesied. Yes, that is the proper English. It is not prophesized, it is prophesied. Okay? It's not a mistake. That is the proper translation. Don't ask me why. I don't know, but that is what it is. V'lo pachtu v'lo tiro ma shekatuv b'Torah. They didn't add or subtract what was in the Torah, chutz mimikra Megillah, except for the Megillah. Now, there's a problem here, right? Because that doesn't usually work, right? That's like saying all the Rosh Yeshiva kept the whole Torah, except they ate treif that one time, right? Meaning it's an Isser in the Torah, right? So conceptually, we got to figure out when it says they didn't add except in this case. So there are two ways to explain what we're about to do, right? Conceptually, one is
Say that they didn't really add anything.
One is to say they didn't really add, meaning what they're doing is tapping into something in the Torah itself. It only looks like it's adding, but in fact, it's actually a fulfillment of something in the Torah itself. The other, which is less likely, is...
That's actually like fully Durabanan.
Well, that clearly doesn't help here, right?
Yeah, they actually added.
Right, because they said Hotiru, right? The other would just say, yeah, they added it for some reason, even though they added its... Right? I mean, it's like it was mutter to eat treif that one time, right? That seems like an unlikely one. The more likely direction is what Yosef said, which is that for some reason, this is not really an addition. What would support what Yosef is saying, besides for it being conceptually smoother? Yes, thank you. The next words in the Gemara, which is my drosh, meaning they added, but what? How do they expound it from the Torah? That means that it seems like what the Gemara is doing is saying this looks like an addition, but in fact, it's tapping into a biblical principle, and therefore it's not an addition. What is the biblical principle that the Gemara derives the justification for Purim from, Yosef? What? A kal vachomer from Shirat Hayam. Right? A kal vachomer from Shirat Hayam. Meaning, Amr Reb Chia bar Avin, Amr Reb Yeshua ben Karcha, Uma me'avdut lecherut, Amrin and Shira. If the Jews celebrated leaving slavery with song, Mimita lechayim lekol shekain. So then being saved from death should justify the same type of celebration. Yes.
And this kind of jumps ahead to Rabbi Dr. Berger's point.
You are going so far ahead, but sure.
But wouldn't this lend a lot of support to the idea that, with this Kal Vachomer, that it's not actually like a supernatural event?
You are way ahead of me, but hold that thought.
Okay.
Hold it, Yonan. You're 100% right, okay? From this Gemara so far, okay? From this Gemara so far, the simplest understanding, as Yosef said, is what? That the Gemara thinks there is a biblical principle in place, derived from Pesach to Purim, that there is seemingly a biblical obligation to celebrate with song or its equivalent being saved from death. Yes? Right? Who essentially reads the Gemara this way? Right, if we want to... Okay, yes, David.
Okay, just a question. This seems like an odd Kal Vachomer to be making, because you would need all planes to be equal aside from like this one thing, then there's one is lesser than another. But, like, I mean, at least with like Shira al Hayam, like, there was like clear evidence of God's hand there versus...
Very good. So David and Yehonan... Okay, fine. David and Yehonan already want to jump to this, right? David and Yonatan already want to jump to the question, okay, they're claiming, whatever they're claiming that this is how you respond to a miracle, right? You're already assuming that that's what's going on here, right? Right? So David is saying, David reads the Gemara and says, whatever the Gemara is saying is there's a chiyuv to celebrate with Hallel, let's say, a miracle, right? That's how he's reading the Gemara. And on that plane, David has a kasha on the Kal Vachomer, which is...
That what happened by Purim is not clear miracle.
Very good. Is that on the one hand, yes, Purim we were saved from death, and Mitzrayim we were saved from slavery, but Purim was more naturalistic, and Pesach was more openly miraculous. So maybe say that the criterion for Shira, for Hallel, for a celebration is a nace. which is me'al derech hateva, right? Which is supernatural, right? Yehonatan responds and he says, that's very nice in theory, but the fact that the Gemara didn't make that argument proves that either the issue here is not miracle, it's salvation, or it's not about supernatural miracle, it's about anything that can be interpreted as God's influence, whether it's naturalistic or not naturalistic is besides the point, right? Okay, but before we get to that, right, we'll get to that in a second, but let's construct the argument, okay? So that's Purim. Maybe before we get to the Chatam Sofer is going to be the key source here, right? We see the parallel by Hanukkah, because on Hanukkah, what does the Gemara say? Right, for the Gemara, what is the paradigmatic celebration of Hanukkah? It's not what you think. Right? In the Gemara's own language, what is the main mitzvah of Hanukkah? The main mitzvah of Hanukkah is?
Shira.
Yeah, it's Hallel. Right? It's Hallel. Right? It's Shira. Right? Because if you look at the Gemara in number 2, the Gemara tells the story. We all know the story. Right? They desecrated the Beit HaMikdash, they were looking for the oil, they found the miraculous oil, etc. And then the Gemara says, Naaseh bones, last line, V'hidliku mimenu shmona yamim, Lishana acheret kiva'um, so next year they establish it, V'asa'um yamim tovim b'halel v'hoda'ah, and they made them holidays with Hallel and Hoda'ah. Right, the definition, this is a shir for another time in Hanukkah, this is also evident when you read the Rambam, but simple pshat in the Gemara is that the main miracle, the main mitzvah of Hanukkah is not the lighting of the Nerot, it's Hallel. Okay, it's Hallel. Keep this in mind when you get to Hanukkah next year, right? This is not like some wild chiddush I found in Achron. It's the Gemara. You know, you can tell me the real mitzvah hayom is the menorah, you'll be wrong, right? Simple pshat in the Gemara is not that way, right? Simple pshat in the Gemara is that the main mitzvah of Hanukkah is Hallel. Right? That's how you celebrate the miracle. Fine. The Gemara in 3 focuses on a different question, which is, as Yehonatan mentioned before, there were other miracles we commemorated with mini holidays and Hallel and the like. All those recorded in Megillat Ta'anit. But all of them were nullified except for Hanukkah and Purim. And the Gemara asks, why is Hanukkah different? So Rabbi Yosef said, what's the difference? Because it has a mitzvah attached to it. There, presumably, it means the candles. Good. But Abaye then says, that doesn't make any sense, because if Hanukkah should go the way of all the other holidays in Megillat Ta'anit, so its mitzvah should disappear also. So what's the final answer the Gemara settles on? Shiny Hanukkah, the Mefarsem Nisa. Right? Hanukkah is given even greater credibility because of the public way in which it publicizes the miracle. And therefore, it survives the nullification of the holidays in Megillat Ta'anit. Okay? But the first thing you see in this Gemara is this sort of paradigm. The simple pshat in the Gemara is that Purim and Hanukkah are not seen as additions. They are seen as expansions or extrapolations from the principle derived from Pesach, that if Pesach warrants song, right, so does Hanukkah and Purim. More specifically, Purim, right? Purim is the paradigm. Yes, Yonatan.
Actually, never mind.
Okay. So, oh, sorry, you're on like the wrong side of my head here. Yeah.
I'm in the sniper spot.
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to know what that means.
Why
Yeah.
didn't they address Purim with regards to the last Gemara we just did?
Yeah, you know.
It wouldn't work because it doesn't have a days that we are really being.
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to, you would have to go back. Obviously, we're working with the assumption it didn't, but yes, you are correct. It's a kasha. Okay, now this model of Purim right, this model of Purim became a halachic model for something known as Purim Katan. Now, what was Purim Katan? So the Maram El Shakar, in the sources I gave you, it's amazing how many people ask me, right? I thought I was very clear on this. They're like, what are the sources that are only in Hebrew? How are we supposed to understand them? And I put before it, I was like, that's the more in-depth one. I gave you an English summary of the main argument afterwards, right? But the more extended argument, which goes as follows. The Maram al-Shakar records a practice that was prevalent throughout the Jewish world, called Purim Katan. What was Purim Katan? So he says, She'elah, Anshei Ir Achad, Heim Ubeit Dinam, Tiknu Beinehem Becharamot, Vaskama Gdola Lehem Valzaram, Valkol Abayim Achreihem, Me'atav Yad Olam. Right? There was a place, right, where their Beit Din had established with a Cherem and a public agreement on them and their children for generations. La'asot et Yom HaAztmaut Yom L'chodesh Tevet, Ki Yom Purim L'chol Dvarav, K'dei L'farsem Nes Echad Gadol Shenasen L'Mahoto Yom. On the 11th of Tevet, they made it a Purim for themselves to publicize the miracle that happened to them in their city. ובכלל תקנתם התקינו שאפילו מי שישנה את מקומו וילך לשכון בעיר אחרת. And they established that even someone who would move away and is descended from the people in this city, לא יסור מעליו חוק התקנה ההיא עד עולם. They will be obligated forever to keep that as a holiday. So he asks, Yoreh HaMoreh, meaning you, Posek, right? Yoreh HaMoreh, tell us, Im yesh koach b'yad anshei ir achat l'taken chayotze b'zeh o lo, v'im takanatam takanam yichul l'gzor ga'af al b'ayim achreim o lo. One, does this takana mean anything? Two, even if it does, can it carry on to the next generation? Aval kol b'ayim achar, v'im yichul l'gzor aval kol b'ayim achreihem, ata shegershu kolam me'ato ha'ir, ונטמעו בעיירות אחרות ובמלכות אחרת, אם חל להם ההסכמה בכל מקום שהם או לא. And even if they can, does that happen even when the entire community is dissolved? Or when the community is dissolved, does the holiday go with it? So the Maram al-Shakar responds, Tshuva, ודאי יכולין הם בני העיר לתקן ביניהם תקנות ולעשות הסכמות וגדרים ולקנוס העובר עליהן אפילו לשים מידת דין תורה. Of course, they can do this. That's it, right? Of course they can. Why not? And he quotes the Rashba, who says that a city always has this type of power. And for sure, when there's Persume Nisa, he thinks it's legitimate. And 3 lines in, on bracha. The Gemara in the 9th paragraph of Brachot already tells you that if an individual has a miracle, there is a bracha to say. What's the bracha? Sha'asa li neis b'makom hazeh. To me. To me. You're close, but no, that's the right for other people's bracha. But for your person, sha'asa li neis. Right, Baruch Sha'asa imi neis b'makom hazeh, v'chein yicholin gam ken anshe ha'ir l'taken al kol b'machrem atzof kol dorot. And therefore, they can establish this. And then he gets into the question, okay, but what about the people who left the city? He says that too, he's also willing to buy. But that's sort of parenthetical to our discussion. It's important for minhag, but it's parenthetical to our discussion at the moment. So the Maram al-Shakar attests to the fact that there was a practice which he approves of, which was creating localized Purim Katan, celebrations with Hallel, for miracles that were local to a city. What is the conceptual justification for that move? So the Maram al-Shakar doesn't tell you. He just puts his stamp of approval on this custom. The Chatam Sofer says, I'll explain what the basis is. So what's the Chatam Sofer's basis, Yonatan?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Did he establish any, groundwork for, saying what is and isn't a miracle, or is it just, whatever the subjective view of that?
We haven't gone to that yet, right? We'll get to that in a minute. Okay? We have to go step by step here. Chatam Sofer turns to this and he says, what is the principle behind this? So he comes up with the following argument. I gave you the long version in 5 and the short version in 6. But let me outline the argument as follows. The Chatam Sofer says as follows. It is a mistake to say that Hanukkah and Purim are Dirabanan. They're not Dirabanan. What are they? They're not Deraisa either. What are they?
There are bonds how to do Deraisa? It's like for cut on his own, right?
Yes, exactly. They are rabbinic expressions of a biblical principle. Meaning, as he says, look at the summarized version in 6, Kviat Yom Moed. By the way, if you're wondering why I have permission to share the translations, right? Because, extended translations you're not usually allowed to. They're not that extended, but the reason was I was the editor on this section in the Koren Machzor, so I asked Ronnie Ziegler for permission, and he sent me the things after it, because my job was to choose the essays that went into the section, right? This is like what I did in my free time in the Kollel in Gush, right back in the day. So that's why I had access to all these. So he gave it to me so I could put it on his sheet. Fine. So the Chatam Sofer says, look, Kviyat Yom Moed b'Yom HaAtzmaut Nesu Kal V'Chomer D'Oraita. What you learn in the Gemara and Megillah is that the obligation to in some way commemorate a miracle is in fact a biblical principle derived from a Kal V'Chomer from Pesach to Purim, and that is the paradigm. How you celebrate it is already Derabanan. Hanukkah we do it one way, Purim we do it another way, but the principle that if a miracle happens to you, you must find a way to express your thanks in some way, that is a biblical principle. So Purim and Hanukkah for the Chatam Sofer are rabbinic expressions of a biblical principle, which is if a miracle happens, you must find a way of recognizing what God did for you. Okay? So therefore, at their core, Purim and Hanukkah are actually biblical. But how you celebrate them, what you do, the question of how you celebrate, how you commemorate, that's derabanan. But the notion that if a miracle happens, you must celebrate, you must do something to show your gratitude to God, that is a biblical principle. Okay? So the Chatam Sofer becomes the halachic justification for the rabbinic thinkers in 48. Now, that's question 1. Question 2 is, well, fine, but what qualifies as a miracle? Okay? Now, again, I'm not going to address the people who think that, maybe for a second we will, but that the state of Israel is a Maaseh Satan. I honestly know what that means, right? Like, there aren't many metaphysical things I understand, but look, how the Satan Rebbe said it was a Maaseh Satan, look, I'm not like a dualist, but like, how much power you attribute to the Satan, it's beyond me, right? There's a bit much for me, but fine. Good, so how do you define a miracle? So, David says, well, he would have thought that it would be a nes me'al derech hateva. What's the problem? The Kal V'Chomer. Right? Is that the Gemara's Kal V'Chomer is derived not from the miracle, right? Because if the key were miracles me'al derech hateva, so then Pesach is greater than Purim. But the Gemara thinks Purim is greater than Pesach because what is the gauge for the Gemara of miracle? What's the gauge?
The scenario. How dangerous.
How dangerous was the scenario from which you were saved? Not how overtly miraculous the salvation was, but what was the quality of what you were of the salvation, right? That's the simple pshat. So now you'll tell me, what about Hanukkah, right? So this is a little bit problematic because on Hanukkah, what is the proximate cause of the holiday?
The proximate, like meaning like
Meaning, what is the actual reason that we celebrate it? What miracle?
Oh, the war.
So we have two possibilities. We have the war, and we have the Pach HaShemen. Now, in the Gemara, the miracle that's emphasized is the Pach HaShemen, right? In Tefillah, which one is emphasized? The war. Which one does the Rambam think was the Makeh B'Patish for it being a holiday? The war. Right? So if you look at the Rambam in number 7, he says, B'bayit Sheni, Kishemalchu Yavan, right? Gazru al Yisrael, batlu datam v'lo nicho otam lasok b'torah b'mitzvot. Right? In the time of Bayit Sheni, so the Greeks decreed that we couldn't keep the Torah, etc. Upashtu yadam b'mamonam v'neitehem v'nechnasu leichal upartzu bo pirtzot v'timu taharot. They took their money and their daughters and they desecrated the Beit HaMikdash. V'tzar lam Yisrael ma'od mibneihem v'lachatzum lachatz gadol. They caused much pressure, etc. Ad Sherichem aleim elokei avotenu, until God had mercy on them. V'hoshiem mi'adam v'yitzilam, until God had mercy and saved them. V'gavru b'nei Chashmonai kohanim agdolim, and saved them, and the Chashmonim became great. V'hoshi Yisrael mi'adam v'hemidu melech min hakohanim v'chazra malchut liYisrael yeter al 200 shana al hachurban hasheni. So it's the war, but more specifically for the Rambam, what is the great celebration? The return of what? Of sovereignty. Even a horribly flawed sovereignty. How do I know that it's a flawed sovereignty? Because first of all, the Chashmonim became evil. Second of all, according to most Rishonim, it was usher for them to be kings because they were Kohanim. So they became evil. It was usher for them to be kings in the first place. Nevertheless, sovereignty is celebrated because sovereignty is worth celebrating, as flawed as it is and as flawed as the leaders are. Okay? So now, with this, let me just get this point out. Yosef, I'll take you 1 second. With all of this in the background, there was a very simple, logical argument that many of the poskim said in 48, which was, the Gemara says we derive Purim from a Kal Vachomer from Pesach. The Kal Vachomer is simply not about whether it's supernatural miracle, but what were we saved from? Life and death is greater than servitude. Right? That's the standard. The Chatam Sofer says this is not an option, it's an obligation to find some way of expressing your thanks for this. The Rambam tells you that Hanukkah, which is the corollary, the celebration is because of a return of a flawed sovereignty, which means we have evidence from Purim of a non-overtly miraculous salvation, from Hanukkah of an imperfect return to sovereignty, both being reasons to celebrate. Therefore, the right thing to do is to come up with a way to celebrate the return of sovereignty and the concomitant salvation of people. I mean, you think about people like my grandfather. This was literal death to life, right? I mean, this is how he got out of Europe, right? And then they were saved from near annihilation during the war itself, right? This is not like exaggeration, right? This is exactly what happened, right? So therefore, if you look, for example, at number 8, so Meshulam Rath, who was a leading posek in the early days of the religious Zionism. I'll just read the English translation of his tshuva. He says, it is obvious in our case, which is relevant to the entire community of Israel and includes deliverance from slavery to freedom. We were redeemed from the subjugation of kingdoms, and we've become free men and have achieved political independence, meaning it's parallel to Pesach. as well as deliverance from death to life, i.e. parallel to Purim. We were saved from the hands of our enemies who sought to exterminate us. Certainly, we have an obligation to institute a holiday, and it was proper that it was established specifically on this day, which was the central miracle, that we went from slavery to freedom through the Declaration of Independence. And if you skip for a moment to 10, Druckmann, who's a current religious Zionist Rosh Hashiva, he writes, the many into the hands of the few. On the eve of the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, the Arab countries declared that within a week they intended to wipe out the entire Yishuv, the Jewish population in the land of Israel. The Arab army's proclamation, we will drive you into the sea, was not a figure of speech, but rather a serious threat to invade the land of Israel from the north, east, and south, so that the Mediterranean Sea to the west would be the Jews' last refuge. Is there a better example of the many into the hands of the few? On Hanukkah, we repeatedly recite the Al-Anisim prayer, in which we thank God for delivering the many into the hands of the few. The Hanukkah miracle took place more than 2,000 years ago, but this wondrous event has happened also in our time. God delivered the many into the hands of the few, and thus saved us from certain death and gave us the gift of our own lives. Is it not appropriate that we thank Him for this? Okay? So that is basically the step-by-step, right, basic argument that was put forward by the poskim. Yes?
So I have a few questions about Rav. So first of all, he has this slavery to freedom analogy. But I think that's a little bit of a stretch because slavery to freedom by Pesach is very much literal slavery to literal freedom, whereas here it's simply non-sovereignty to sovereignty. Also by his life and death.
Good. So we definitely can quibble on that, right? Meaning you can say, well, this is sovereignty, which is not the same. Now, the response would be, but Hanukkah establishes as a paradigm of sovereignty per se.
Yeah.
Okay.
Life and death. Seen from Purim, that Purim was life and death because it was literally the entirety of the Jewish populace.
Hold the thought for a minute.
And also by the miracle part, by Hanukkah there was the extra sort of miracle of the oil.
So by Hanukkah, you're right. There is a mix of a supernatural,
yeah.
Right? The question is that relevant? In the Purim Gemara, it sounds like it's not. In the Rambam's record of Hanukkah, it seems like it's not. But you're right. You could read it as, you're right. Yes.
Because the Gemara about Hanukkah, just noticing how, specifically in that bracelet, it doesn't just mention Hanukkah, it also mentions Kafeh B'Kislev. So maybe you can say like the Pach Hashem is only being about the Kafeh B'Kislev, not about the entire thing as a whole.
I think it would have gone the opposite way. If anything, it would have been the opposite. Right? The Pach Hashemen, which is 8 days, is the whole thing. Right? The victory doesn't need to be 8 days. The Pach Hashemen is what makes it 8 days. I would have flipped it, if anything.
For example, you also connect to the day because like there's no reason to celebrate the day.
Okay, good. Okay. Now, let's try to poke holes. Let's try to poke holes, right? So now, let's assume that you're not viciously anti-Zionist. Well, you know what? No, let's start with that, right? Let's say you're viciously anti-Zionist, okay? So, obviously, we can't even begin this conversation. But, Ray, Dr. Berger, that I gave you, is not talking about Hallel. Someone was like, it's too emotional. He's not talking about Hallel. He's talking about his reflections on the state of Israel. So this is really, right? But he makes a point, which I think is very important, right? He makes a overarching point in favor of the religious significance of the state of Israel, right? This is not a statement that it's Reshit Tzmichas Gulatenu. I'm not making any particular claim. I'm making a claim that it should be recognized as having been the product of Hashgacha writ large. What is Dr. Berger's basic argument? Right? If you had to boil down his argument, what is his argument?
Oh, that the miracle isn't supernatural, it's just a large, significant Jewish event. And
therefore, but it's more than that. He makes a very important argument, right? Meaning you're right, but he makes a broader argument, which is, Rami.
So if you want, if we're Jews and we believe that there is a higher entity out there, when you have certain events of this magnitude, it would kind of ruin the point of believing in God if you don't believe that He had any involvement in this.
Basically, yes. Meaning, right? Dr. Berger basically says, look. whatever you think hashgacha is or is not, the one thing that seems pretty clear in Tanakh is that major events that affect the entirety of the Jewish people are guided by hashgacha, right? That is like the ABCs of Tanakh, right? Literally. Like, literally everywhere in Chumash, Navi, like everything, you know? If you sin, you'll go into Galut. When you do tshuva, you'll come back from Galut. Like, you know, those very basic descriptions in Tanakh are like everywhere. You know, that's literally the content of all the major promises. This is like basic to Tanakh. Where's Yotam? Wherever he went, right? We did it, there you are, right? Yotam knows we did this morning, right? This is in Shlomo's Tefillah when he builds the Beit HaMikdash. He says, I know that if we sin, we will go into Galut, and if we are righteous, we will come back, right? This is like over and over and over in Tanakh. This is like ABCs. So, Dr. Berger says, do I believe that God intervenes frequently, even in everyday affairs of relatively little moment? Do I think that there is a period of Hester upon which natural processes almost invariably prevail? Do I consider divine intervention more likely in Jewish history than in affairs of the nations of the world? Do I assign a positive, negative, or neutral evaluation to the event under consideration? Do I regard it as a passing episode or as a critical development in history? Right? He says, although God's knowledge is unlimited, and the possibility of his intervention is always present, many major authorities have maintained that miraculous intervention in the daily lives of ordinary Jews is relatively infrequent, and some degree of uncertainty extends to larger matters as well. He said, look, I'm willing to be a minimalist on hashgacha, right? I'm inclined to believe, for example, that God had something to do with the low casualty rate following the launching of Scud missiles toward Israel, but I do not feel that my faith requires the categorical affirmation that he changed the flight path of a particular missile or caused its warhead to malfunction, right? Meaning he said, look, he's willing to be a minimalist on hashgacha, right? Nonetheless, there are events that are so earth-shaking within the context of Jewish belief that the failure to attribute them to divine intervention leaves Judaism bereft of meaningful faith in the God of Chazal and of the prophets. Right? He never pulls his punches, ever. Right? He's like, look, whatever you want to say about hashgacha, if you don't believe that major events that affect the entirety of the Jewish people, God is somehow involved in like the broad scope of things, then you are just not reading Judaism. You're just not. You're just not.
For all the flaws in the argument, Satmar seems to agree with this.
Right? Right? And he says, the establishment of the state of Israel, the capture of Jerusalem are such events. Given the most fundamental assumptions about providence, the goodness of God and his concern for the Jewish people, the position that developments of such magnitude came about wholly through the workings of an impersonal historical process is inadmissible. It banishes God from history and declares in effect that the Lord has forsaken the earth. If the hand of God is not to be found in these events, where is it to be found? And then, if he couldn't be as harsher, right? He then says the obvious, which is, why is it, I'll say it slightly nicer than he does, well, no, I'll say it meaner than he does, and then we'll do his, which might be meaner, might not, which is, I'll just be very blunt, how can Haredi people who write these endless books about how every person you meet on the street is Hashgacha Pratis, look at the state of Israel and say, but that's an accident. No, it's not. The fortune cookie that you open. If you read another story about Hashgacha Pratis, what fortune cookie message you had, right? I will go nuts. But the same people who write those stories look at the state of Israel and say, that's not God, that's the Satan. Right? He says one of the great ironies in contemporary Jewish piety is that many deeply religious Jews have inverted the hierarchy of providential events. For many non-Zionist Orthodox Jews, the operation of micro-providence is taken for granted to the point where innumerable events in the lives of prominent rabbis are confidently regarded as miracles. Right? Meaning, he's like, many yeshivish people just say, aha, Rav Moshe Feinstein stopped at this red light and like who knows what happened. Right? Hashgacha, and they write these endless books, right, of stories. He's like, I mean, that's wonderful and it works to some Rishonim. But if that's Hashgacha Pratis, then the establishment of the state of Israel definitely is Hashgacha Pratis. It doesn't work the other way. If the establishment of the state of Israel is Hashgacha, that does not imply that every little story that happened in your life is directly Hashgacha. But if you're willing to accept the maximalist position that every wrong turn that you make and every thing you pull out of your pocket in whatever order is hashgacha, then the establishment of the State of Israel is definitely hashgacha. That fits all, right? That checks all the boxes. Right, he says, at the same time, the return of the land of Israel to the Jewish people is assigned no religious value whatever. It is true that God intervenes to protect the land, right? And he said, but the same people will tell you, but he's protecting the land. Because the exact same people who say the state is not a miracle will say, but God redirected every Scud missile during, right, the Gulf War, right? It's like the exact same people, right? He's like, this is just, right? Nonetheless, he appears to have played no role in the establishment of the state. The position is so incongruous that it rarely, if ever, is formulated in such stark terms. Right? Elsewhere in the piece, if I remember, I think I cut this out, he says, he finds it also offensive that the same people will say that God was directly responsible through Hashgacha for the Holocaust, but not the State of Israel. He's like, that's also a corollary that's found in the exact same communities. Right? He's like, all of this is theologically, right? So, on the question of, can you really say that God is no way involved in this? There's a reason I'm a religious Zionist, right? It's like, I just find that so... I like Dr. Berger, I really am a hashgacha pratis minimalist, right? Like, I do not get excited by these stories of wrong turns and, and like, I met this person and I hear these stories and they're cringeworthy. I mean, I have heard the worst. I've heard them from on the right, I've heard them on the left. I once heard a sheer from someone on the left who said it was like hashgacha that someone sat down to him when he decided to eat not kosher and had an inspiring conversation with him, and that was God's way of inspiring him. But then the end of the conversation we still ate the non-kosher thing, and that inspired. I was like, I have no idea. Right? People have these very odd stories, right, about hashgacha across the board. I don't know what they mean, right? But I do know that if you read Tanakh, major events that apply to the entire Jewish people, everyone agrees that God is involved. So, thank you, David. So with that, can you, assuming you're not willing to take that, what I agree with Dr. Berger, completely incongruous view of Jewish history, why might you believe that, yes, the State of Israel reflects hashgacha writ large, and still not want to reject the argument and not want to say set up a holiday or say Hallel? What would be the logic that would say I accept that it's some sort of miracle, but you shouldn't ... Yes.
Maybe we could challenge the authority of some people do say, oh, they have no authority outside Israel.
Okay, good. One possibility is the authority question, right? Is to basically say, we don't accept the possibility that anyone close Chazal can do this. The problem is the custom for hundreds of years of Purim Katan. So what will you have to do?
Say that it would only apply to say any city founded after the...
Or you'll just have to reject it. You'll have to say we don't paskin like the Maram al-Shakar. You'll have to say that practice of Jewish communities for hundreds of years is wrong. You can do that, but you have to realize what you're doing. Right? Okay, what else? What else might you do?
I'd say maybe you could also just limit to say only cities that were around 1948 can do.
I mean, you could do right, but let's go more broadly. Or you could, right? Yeah, well, so this. Or you could do what? You could establish what? You could, despite the simple implication of the Gemara and Megillah, you could go in David's direction, which is say it needs a supernatural miracle, which again is hard to justify in light of the Purim. But if you wanted to stretch it, you could say, but Hanukkah also has a supernatural component, and maybe in some way that sheds light on Purim, then you're going to have to sort of justify Purim out of the story. It's hard, but you could go in that direction. It's just sort of stretching it. You could also be, just in general, a liturgical conservatist, right? Meaning you could have a general tendency to not add to Tefillah, right? Which overpowers basically all of your other impulses. You could do that, right? You could just say we just don't add, right? You could also say that maybe Purim and Hanukkah were more universal, more national than the established state of Israel. what would you do with the model of Purim Katan? Either reject it, or say, maybe Yom HaAtzmaut is justifiably celebrated by people like my grandfather who actually fought in 48, right? But you need a even higher level national miracle to justify a permanent national holiday for people who didn't personally celebrate, right? So that would be like a very clever sort of, right, combination, right? Now, what I gave you here were two people who more or less are either identified as religious Zionists or quasi in that world, meaning that they take the significance of the establishment of Israel seriously, but they still say you shouldn't say Hallel, you shouldn't establish a holiday. And those are Rabbi Ovadia Yosef and Rabbi Soloveitchik. Okay? We don't have time to read everything inside, but luckily I bulleted all the points in Rabbi Ovadia, so you can get a good summary. So Rabbi Ovadia quotes the argument. So his first argument is, for Hallel with a bracha, you need all of the Jewish people. This is not all the Jewish people. It's just the Jews who were living in Israel at the time. And therefore, he argues that this warrants Hallel without a bracha, potentially. Right? That Hallel with a bracha needs higher level, needs the whole, and he argues that this is not. Now you could counter that and say, it really is. Right? Meaning the implication of the state of Israel really were for all Jews. Right?
But not all Jews were in Israel.
Correct. He would say they're not all in Israel, and you could counter and say, yeah, but the implications politically for what it did for Jews everywhere is, right, does affect it. Okay, so you could quibble on that point. But Rav Ovadia says maybe for a bracha it needs to be fully all Jews, and this was only Jews in Israel, and he would have to deny the relevance of the political implications for other Jews. Yes, Sean.
What would he say about the kingdom of Israel having been already exiled?
Yeah, I don't know, right? The counter would be, but wait a second, they seem to have been saying Hallel even in Purim Katan, and yeah, who says that Hanukkah and Purim are really the whole, right, are all Jews? In Purim we know, right? I mean, maybe it is because Achashverosh was king of the world or whatever, but okay. What? But Hanukkah was not everybody. I mean, yeah, right. You'd have to. Fine.
Did they say Hallel on Purim Katan?
What? Yeah, they said Hallel on Purim Katan. There's no point. Yeah, of course. Presumably with the bracha. Yeah.
Question.
That seems to be what they did.
Were political implications necessarily good for Jews outside of Israel?
Okay, 1 second. So that's his first argument. His second argument is his second point is maybe you would argue that anything that happens in Israel implies to all of Klal Yisrael automatically, which is something we find in Paralel Davar Shel Tzibor, that the only people who count as Jews for the purpose of Paralel Davar Shel Tzibor are people who live in Israel. So he says, so there is good evidence that the fact that it only happened in Israel is enough to make it national for all Jews. But maybe you'd say that's unique to Horah. Okay, so he parries that argument. Then he says, maybe it's an imperfect salvation for two reasons, right? One is it wasn't miraculous, like Hanukkah. How would you counter that? Purim, right? I mean, Purim seems to be not miraculous, right? Overtly miraculous. And two is that it's incomplete. Right? It's incomplete. Sorry. In this paragraph, he just says it's not miraculous, and therefore people can explain it other ways. Right? Again, Purim seems to be a kasha on that, but that's his argument. Then, the next point he says is not everyone agreeing with the Chassam Sofer that Hallel should be said every year. Maybe it's only the year of, right? So maybe you just have to reject the Chatam Sofer. Then his next point is, maybe it's true that it was an important event, but it's incomplete because we still have enemies and we're still fighting and there isn't peace. What's the counter to that? Chashmonaim and Purim. Purim, the Gemara itself says, we used to be Avdei Achashverosh, and afterwards, Adayin Avdei Achashverosh Anan. Meaning, the Gemara itself says that's the reality of Purim, and that was the reality of Hanukkah. Okay? Fine. Then he says maybe since the Beit Yosef quotes the Midrash who says even on Pesach we don't say Hallel after the first day with a bracha. Well, sorry, full Hallel, and according to Sfardim with a bracha at all, right? After the first day of Pesach, because why? Because the Mitzrim died, and that makes us sad. So he says, well, Arabs died and Jews died, so yes, we're celebrating it, but it's also sad, so you don't say Hallel. What's the obvious problem? Purim and Chanukah we do. So what is his answer? Chanukah we're singing for the Neis Pach Hashemen. What's the problem? The Gemara says it's about, the Rambam and the Gemara seem to not say that. Right? Fine. Great. Right. So therefore, what does he end up?
What do you mean by the Gemara seems to definitely not say that?
Because, what do you mean?
Oh, I guess you're referring to the Gemara seems to.
Yeah. So therefore, what's Rav Ovadia's conclusion? It's justifiable. He wouldn't do it, but if someone wants to do it, don't stop them. Why? Because he tries to basically raise a bunch of arguments, but as we noted, basically every argument can be refuted. The Rav also opposed it, even though he believed in the importance of the state of Israel. What was his argument? Why didn't he think you should do it? Yeah, basically. Because the Rav in general was just conservative on these issues. Right? And he basically, right, if you look at Rav Shechter quotes him, he says, right, he didn't like the ideas of ceremonies. Right? He didn't like the creation of ceremonies at all. He just didn't like it. Right? He thought that they were wrong. We don't have the authority to do that. And therefore, he just thought that we shouldn't set up a holiday because he was a liturgical and ceremonial conservative. He just didn't believe we could do it. Now, that's what he says here. I'll note that in the letter, which I don't have time to read, but in Community Covenant, whatever, the CCC book by the Rav, letter 15, he doesn't seem as opposed. He just thinks that you shouldn't establish it for everybody. He leaves everyone community to do it themselves. On balance, therefore, what emerges, right, is within the people who believe that there is a significance to the state of Israel, there's a good argument to be made that you should celebrate it and maybe even say Hallel with a bracha. On the other hand, the counter is to say there might be nuanced reasons why you shouldn't, right? Either in general, we don't establish new holidays, we don't have the authority, which might entail rejecting Maram al-Shakar, the Chatam Sofer, or in some way distinguishing the miracles of Purim and Chanukah from the miracles of 48 and 67. Now there is one more argument, right, which is to say, maybe you really think that it is a miracle and it deserves a holiday, but there's one technical problem with it.
You don't have a Navi to
No, not that. A very technical problem.
Not all the rabbis agree.
No, even more technical. Which is that maybe Yom HaAtzmaut, there isn't really a day that has like intrinsic worth that you can point to as the holiday. Right? Rav Unterman basically said this. I mentioned this Rav Ashi before. Rav Unterman, the chief rabbi of Israel, felt that Yom HaAtzmaut, despite all the miracles, didn't have like a moment in time where there was like an event that you could solidify it and say, this is the day you do it. Therefore, he had a unique position that you say Hallel without a bracha on Yom HaAtzmaut, but Hallel with a bracha on Yom Yerushalayim. Because Yom Yerushalayim has a very particular event you're celebrating, as opposed to Yom HaAtzmaut, where we're like picking a symbolic day which sort of captures something that happened over a long time.
But as much as you pick a symbolic day, you're picking a symbolic day because you don't have a day that...
Correct. Meaning his argument is basically, it is miraculous, but to say Hallel on a particular day, you need to find a day. Now, I will note that Rav Shechter, despite what he quotes in the Rav, himself has a very radical position, which is, he says it without a bracha, but, and he's the only person in the world I know who does this, he thinks, no, Yom HaAtzmaut has Kedushat Hayom, so much so that even though, like this year in Israel, we celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut not on Hey Iyar, to prevent Chilul Shabbos, Rav Shechter will celebrate it on Hey Iyar. He always does. So in YU, you have this ridiculous phenomenon, which is Yom HaAztmaut of Israel, every minyan except for if Shechter's minyan will say Hallel. But on Hey no matter when Israel is celebrating Yom HaAtzmaut, Rav Shechter will say Hallel because he thinks you should say Hallel, but he actually believes there is an importance to the day, and therefore will only do it on Hey Iyar. It's unreal to see this in YU. It's like, because you'll have the people who are like, they don't want to say Hallel. They believe it's important, but they don't want to say Hallel because the Rav didn't say Hallel. They will say Hallel because other people, they'll say Hallel in the middle of davening, they'll say the end of davening like Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, or they'll say it on a different day like Rav Shechter. It's like, it's utter chaos, right? It's like everybody thinks that it's a miracle that should be recognized, but no one can agree how. Which is maybe the greatest miracle of being Jews. But fine, right? That is like the most Jewish thing I've ever heard, right? But I just want to make the point that what I think this indicates is that there are two broad reasons why you might not say Hallel or celebrate it. One is, in principle, you don't think it's worth celebrating, right? The other is, you do, but for some technical reason, you don't think it deserves a bracha, you're a liturgical conservative, right, etc., right? You should recognize, right, both the legitimacy of making an argument in favor, and the fact that arguing that you shouldn't say Hallel isn't necessarily a statement that you're not recognizing the miracle. There are other formal reasons why you might not do it. Okay? But anyways, this is sort of a snapshot of the arguments that have been put forth in favor and against, just to give you an idea, right? And there's a lot going on here, because it's both a theological question, as you see in Dr. Berger, as well as a halachic formal one, right? And they sort of intersect in interesting ways. And this hopefully at least deepens your understanding of the type of things that are at stake, right? I'll just end with saying, some people think that this is like a barometer of how Zionist you are, right? Whether you say Hallel or not, and if you say it with a bracha. It really isn't, right? Meaning, it's a question, it's a theological question, it's a halachic question, and you can theologically believe you should celebrate it and have a halachic reason to not say a bracha, to only say a bracha Yom Yerushalayim and not Yom HaAtzmaut, right? You have to separate them, right? The question of how Zionist you are isn't related to whether that should be celebrated with a holiday on He'iyar with Hallel with a bracha, right? The Chassam Sofer's idea that you should find some way to thank God for it, right? You can buy that and still recognize that Chassam Sofer himself says, but how you celebrate it is not written in stone. Once you have the Chassam Sofer, so you can even go farther and say, you should celebrate, but maybe not with Hallel with a bracha, right? Just like on Purim, we don't say Hallel with a bracha. We do things which are equivalent to it, right? Okay, we're a little bit over time, but that's the snapshot of it, and hopefully that gave you a little bit of a halachic and theological basis for this conversation. And we'll, shkoyach guys and parents. Shkoyach.